The silence of deep space was a comforting constant for the crew of the Silver Fawn. Its thrusters hummed steadily as the ship cut through the vast void of the Andromeda sector, far from the eyes of any law enforcement patrols or prying eyes. Captain Rosa Keel leaned back in her command chair, a rare smile playing across her lips as she surveyed the ship's bridge. Today, they had pulled off the heist of a lifetime. All systems running smooth, Cap, came the gravelly voice of Varric, her second-in-command. The massive cyborg stood at the helm, his cybernetic eye scanning the ship's status on the console. His voice betrayed a hint of unease, despite the success of their mission. Rosa ran her fingers through her short, silver hair, her feline-like eyes glowing faintly in the low light of the bridge. She was a veteran of the galactic underworld, a predator in a world of prey, and she knew when a win was worth celebrating. This one, she thought, was worth much more. Good work, Rosa purred. We'll be rich beyond our wildest dreams once we hand her over. A couple more jobs like this, and we can buy a planet of our own, far from the Galactic Enforcement Agency's radar. The crew had kidnapped high-value targets before politicians, warlords, even royalty, but this was different. The young woman they had plucked from Area 9 was special. Rosa didn't have all the details, but the contract had been simple: kidnap the girl, wait for the payment, and disappear into the stars. No questions. No complications. Easy money. Varric, however, wasn't convinced. He glanced at the captain, his mechanical arm twitching slightly as he worked at the controls. I don't like this. Cap feels too clean, too easy. We didn't have any resistance, no heat on us since we grabbed the girl. Rosa turned her glowing eyes on him. You're paranoid, Varric. We've done bigger jobs with more at stake. Relax. It's just another rich brat who crossed the wrong people. Varric grunted but didn't argue further. Something still felt wrong. He had been part of Rosa's crew for nearly a decade, and his instincts had kept him alive more times than he could count. Still, Rosa was the captain, and he trusted her judgment most of the time. Further down the corridor, in the bowels of the Silver Fawn, the prize they had captured lay unconscious in a stasis pod, her body encased in a shimmering blue light. The girl, barely in her 20s, was dressed in simple, civilian clothes, nothing that would suggest she was special. But her features, pale and delicate, hinted at something more. There was an odd calmness to her face, even in her unconscious state, as if she had been through worse. The door to the stasis room slid open, and one of the crew members, a wiry man named Joran, entered to check on their captive. He ran diagnostics on the pod, his thin fingers darting across the console. Everything was stable. You're worth a fortune, little lady, Joran muttered under his breath. He smirked, tapping the glass of the pod. Wonder what you did to make someone pay this much for your head. Suddenly, the ship's comm system crackled to life. Crew, report to the bridge. Now, Rosa's voice commanded, her tone cold and sharp. Joran frowned but didn't hesitate, jogging toward the bridge. Something was up. When he arrived, the rest of the crew had already assembled. Rosa stood at the center, her arms crossed, staring intently at the ship's main display. Varric hovered by her side, his jaw clenched. The screen showed a blinking signal on the edge of their long-range sensors. What's going on? Joran asked, sliding into his seat. Rosa didn't answer right away. Varric leaned forward, his mechanical eye scanning the data. There's something on our tail. It just showed up on long range, but it's gaining fast. Faster than anything we've seen. Joran's eyes widened. Pirates? Rosa shook her head. No. Pirates would have ambushed us out of hyperspace. This one's too clean, too precise. The Silver Fawn was a fast, heavily armed ship, designed to outrun most trouble in the galaxy. But whatever was closing in on them, it wasn't stopping, and it wasn't making its presence known through any standard channels. As the blinking dot grew closer, Varric's mechanical eyes zoomed in, enhancing the image. It's a single ship, he said, his voice unusually quiet. Rosa's eyes narrowed. One ship? What the hell kind of ship moves that fast? Before anyone could answer, the ship's comm system lit up, a direct transmission cutting through the static. The voice on the other end was deep, cold, and unmistakable. You have something of mine, the voice said. Rosa's stomach turned to ice. She didn't need a name to recognize the voice. It was the kind of voice that was whispered about in the dark corners of the galaxy, a voice that belonged to a legend. Kane Drake. The deadliest human in the galaxy. She had heard the stories. Every criminal in the universe had. Kane Drake wasn't just a soldier turned mercenary, he was a walking nightmare. Entire fleets had fallen to him, and his reputation was one of utter destruction. Some said he had retired, disappeared into the abyss of space. Others claimed he had died in one of his last battles. But now, it seemed the rumors were wrong. He wasn't dead. He was coming for them. What do we do, Captain? Joran asked, his voice shaking slightly. Even he knew what this meant. Rosa's mind raced. They couldn't outrun Drake. His ship was faster, more advanced, and armed to the teeth. Fighting him head-on was suicide. Prepare the ship for evasive maneuvers, she ordered, her voice tight but steady. We'll lose him in the Moira Nebula. The Moira Nebula was a volatile region of space, filled with electromagnetic storms and gravitational anomalies. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance. If they could hide there long enough, maybe Drake would give up the chase. As the crew scrambled to obey her commands, Rosa stared out at the cold expanse of space. This was supposed to be easy. Just another job. But now, they had crossed the deadliest man in the galaxy, and there was no turning back. In the stasis pod, the girl stirred, her eyes flickering open. She was disoriented, but only for a moment. Her breath was steady as she took in her surroundings. Lyra Drake had been taken, but she knew one thing for sure. Her father was coming. The Silver Fawn hurtled through hyperspace, its engines straining as the crew pushed the ship to its limits. Outside the viewport, streaks of starlight blurred past in endless streams, but no one on the bridge was admiring the view. Their focus was on the blinking icon on the ship's long-range scanner, tracking the relentless predator tailing them. Captain Rosa Keel stood at the center of the bridge, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as her crew worked frantically around her. She had been in tough spots before, but none like this. No one escaped Kane Drake once he was on their trail. His reputation was brutal and absolute, the deadliest man in the galaxy, a ghost who appeared when you least expected him and left only wreckage in his wake. Rosa's lips tightened into a thin line as Varric, her second-in-command, looked up from his console. His cybernetic eye whirred softly as it analyzed the data. He's still gaining on us. We need to do something fast, Captain. Any chance he's bluffing? Joran asked from his station, his voice betraying the hope that was not shared by the rest of the crew. Drake doesn't bluff, Varric said grimly. If he's after us, we're dead unless we find a way out. Rosa paced the length of the bridge, thinking furiously. She had one advantage: Drake didn't know the terrain ahead as well as she did. She had flown these star lanes more times than she could count, smuggling goods and avoiding patrols. If she could lure him into the Moira Nebula, they might have a shot at losing him. The nebula was a stormy, unpredictable mess, where even the most advanced ships could get scrambled or lost. It was risky, but it was their only hope. Set a course for the nebula, Rosa ordered, her voice firm. We'll lose him in there. Varric gave her a sidelong glance, hesitating. It's dangerous, Captain. Even if we make it in, the storms dash. I know the risks, Varric. Rosa snapped, her patience fraying. But we don't have a choice. Varric clenched his jaw, but he nodded and keyed in the new coordinates. The ship banked sharply, changing course toward the swirling mass of dark, electric clouds that dominated the space ahead. The Moira Nebula loomed in the distance, its turbulent energy casting flickers of lightning through the void. It was beautiful in a way, but it was also a death trap for any ship that ventured too close. Behind them, Kane Drake's ship, the Widowmaker, was a dark silhouette against the vastness of space, its engines flaring as it closed the distance with terrifying precision. Inside the cockpit, Kane sat calm and silent, his eyes locked on the faint signature of the silver fawn on his HUD. He had been in this situation before hunting prey through the vastness of space. They always ran, and he always caught them. But this time, it was different. This time, it was personal. Course change detected, the ship's AI chimed softly. Kane glanced at the display, seeing the silver fawn veering toward the nebula. His brow furrowed. The Moira Nebula was a dangerous choice, even for desperate smugglers. Its storms could tear apart even the strongest shields, and the gravitational anomalies could throw off even the most advanced navigational systems. But he wasn't about to let them slip away. Not after they had taken his daughter. Lock course, Kane commanded. Maintain pursuit. The AI complied, and the Widowmaker followed without hesitation. Kane leaned back in his seat, his mind focused on the hunt. He wasn't worried about the nebula. His ship was faster and more advanced than theirs. He had faced worse and survived. What he couldn't afford was losing Lyra. In the depths of the Silver Fawn, Lyra Drake had regained her full senses. Her body was still weak from the stasis field, but her mind was sharp. She had spent years training under her father, learning to think, to move, to act in moments of crisis. And right now, she needed every bit of that training. The room around her was sterile and cold, the stasis pod's hum still fading in her ears. She quickly assessed her surroundings. There were no guards, just a single security bot floating lazily by the door. Either her captors didn't realize who she was, or they had underestimated her. Her father had always taught her one rule above all others: never rely on someone else to save you. Lyra smirked to herself as she stood, her legs unsteady at first. She had a feeling her father was already on his way, but she didn't intend to wait for him. Carefully, she approached the security bot, moving silently across the floor. "Activate manual override," she whispered, using the command protocol her father had drilled into her from a young age. "Security clearance, Drake 7. The bot's single eye blinked in acknowledgement, and it beeped softly as it accessed the ship's systems. Lyra watched as the doors to her holding chamber unlocked with a quiet hiss. "Too easy," she muttered, stepping out into the corridor. The ship wasn't large, and it didn't take her long to find her way to the central corridor. From the distant sounds of activity, the crew was clearly on high alert, probably aware that someone was coming for them. They didn't know it yet, but their problems were about to get much worse. Back on the bridge, Rosa watched as the Silver Fawn approached the edge of the nebula. The swirling clouds of energy crackled with lightning, their gravitational fields shifting unpredictably. She clenched her fists as the ship's proximity alarms began to blare. "We're entering the nebula," Varric warned. "Shields at maximum." "Steady," Rosa ordered. "This is where we lose him." The Silver Fawn plunged into the nebula, its system struggling to adjust to the chaotic environment. The ship rattled as it was buffeted by waves of electromagnetic interference, but Rosa kept her hand steady on the controls. She knew how to navigate these storms. But as they ventured deeper, the sensors lit up again. Drake hadn't stopped his pursuit. Varric's voice was tight. "He's still behind us. That ship of his. It's cutting through the storm like it's nothing." Rosa cursed under her breath. Kane Drake was more relentless than she had imagined. But she wasn't about to give up. If they could make it to the core of the nebula, the most volatile area, maybe they could shake him there. "Keep going," Rosa ordered. "Push deeper into the storm." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. The screens flickered as bursts of lightning lit up the viewports, illuminating the chaotic space around them. But still, the blinking dot of Drake's ship stayed on their scanners, unwavering. Rosa felt a growing sense of dread. No matter what they did, they couldn't shake him. And it was only a matter of time before. Suddenly, the ship lurched as a warning siren blared. "We've been hit," Joran shouted. "Rear thrusters are down." Rosa's heart sank. Drake hadn't fired to kill, he was crippling them, piece by piece. She had underestimated him, and now they were running out of options. "We're sitting ducks in this storm," Varric growled. Rosa gritted her teeth. "Prepare for combat. If he wants a fight, we'll give him one." On board the Widowmaker, Kane watched as the Silver Fong faltered, its thrusters damaged. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. This was business. Cold, calculated, and personal. The nebulous storms raged around him, but his ship's advanced systems compensated for the interference. He locked onto the Silver Fong's hull with a boarding tether and activated his weapons systems, ready to breach. As he prepared to board, his hand hesitated for the briefest of moments. The face of his daughter flashed in his mind, her smile, her fierce determination. He would save her. He would destroy anyone who dared to harm her. And then, when this was all over, there would be hell to pay. Kane initiated the breach. The Silver Fong groaned under the strain of the Moira Nebula's raging storms. The ship's hull creaked as bursts of electromagnetic energy crackled across its shields, which flickered weakly in response. Inside, the crew scrambled to repair the damage, but there was no mistaking the fact: Kane Drake had them cornered. On the bridge, Captain Rosa Keel paced back and forth, her frustration growing with each passing second. She had thought the nebula would be their salvation, but instead, it had become their death trap. Her keen eyes flicked to the radar screen, where Kane's ship, the Widowmaker, was still locked onto them, unfazed by the storm that raged around them. Varric, her second in command, stood by the console, his jaw clenched as he monitored the damage reports. Shields are down to 30%, and the rear thrusters are still offline. If we take another hit, we're done. Rosa cursed under her breath, her mind racing. What about weapons? Can we still fire? Varric shook his head. Not effectively. The nebula's interference is screwing with targeting systems. Even if we managed to land a shot, it'd be a miracle. Joran, who had been manning the communications terminal, looked up nervously. Cap, we should consider surrendering. Maybe we can bargain with him, cut a deal. Kane Drake doesn't kill people unless Dash shed it, Joran, Rosa snapped. You think we're gonna bargain with him? He's not a merc we can bribe, he's a war machine. The moment we give up, we're dead. Varric spoke quietly, glancing at Rosa. He's coming for the girl, not us. Maybe if we give her up, Dash, I said no. Rosa's voice cut through the bridge, sharp and final. The contract says we deliver her alive, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We don't get paid if she's dead. Drake's not the only one we have to worry about. Varric stared at her for a moment, but he didn't push further. Rosa's mind was set. Still, the unease in the crew was palpable. They all knew Kane Drake was closing in, and there was no escaping him. In the lower decks of the ship, Lyra Drake moved with careful precision through the dimly lit corridors. Her heart raced, but she kept her breathing steady, her focus razor-sharp. She had already disarmed the basic security systems in place, and now she was on her way to the armory. She didn't know exactly what kind of weapons the Silver Fong carried, but she was determined to find something useful. If her father was on his way, she would meet him halfway. She slipped around a corner and ducked into a side room as she heard footsteps approaching. 2 crew members, heavily armed, passed by, talking in low voices about the damage the ship had taken. They didn't notice her, and when the coast was clear, Lyra continued toward her target. As she reached the armory, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, rows of weapons were neatly arranged on racks: energy rifles, plasma grenades, and a variety of blasters. Lyra's eyes scanned the selection quickly, and she grabbed a small, handheld plasma cutter from a shelf. It wasn't a weapon, but it would do for what she had planned. She heard footsteps behind her and spun around just in time to see one of the crew members, a tall, burly man with a scar across his face, step into the armory. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw her standing there. "You're not supposed to be Dash," she started, but Lyra didn't wait for him to finish. In a blur of movement, she lunged forward, using the plasma cutter to slash through the power conduit on the wall. The lights in the armory flickered as the electrical system shorted out, and the man barely had time to react before Lyra disarmed him with a swift strike to the throat, knocking him unconscious. Lyra stood over the fallen crewman, her breathing steady. She hadn't killed him. Her father had taught her never to take a life unless absolutely necessary. But she knew there wouldn't be time to avoid bloodshed for much longer. With the plasma cutter in hand, she set off toward the engineering bay. She had a plan, a risky one, but it might give them the opening they needed to get off this ship. Above, Kane Drake moved with calculated precision through the halls of the Silver Fawn, his every step measured, his every action deliberate. His boarding tether had sliced cleanly through the ship's outer hull, and he had entered without a sound. The crew hadn't even realized he was on board. His plasma rifle was slung across his back, but so far, he hadn't needed to use it. The few crew members he had encountered were left incapacitated, their bodies lying in unconscious heaps in the dark corridors. Kane wasn't here to kill. He was here for one reason, and one reason only, to get his daughter back. He made his way toward the ship's command center, his senses finely tuned to every sound and movement around him. His face remained expressionless, his emotions locked away behind a wall of hardened discipline. But inside, the rage burned cold and fierce. As he approached the central corridor leading to the bridge, he heard the telltale sound of heavy footsteps, multiple guards, coming his way. Kane pressed himself against the wall, waiting. The guards turned the corner, two of them armed with heavy rifles. Before they could react, Kane was upon them. In a blur of movement, he disarmed the first guard with a single, bone-crunching twist of the wrist, sending the rifle clattering to the floor. The second guard barely had time to raise his weapon before Kane slammed him into the wall with enough force to knock him unconscious. Kane retrieved one of the guard's blasters and continued his advance. He didn't need a map of the ship. He knew exactly where the command center was and where the stasis pods were kept. He was getting closer to Lyra. On the bridge, Rosa's hands gripped the armrests of her chair as the ship shook violently. Another barrage of energy blasts from Drake's ship had torn through their remaining shields, and the hull integrity was deteriorating rapidly. "Captain, we've got a breach," Joran shouted. "Portside, near the lower decks." "He's on board." Rosa's eyes narrowed. "He's here?" Varric glanced at her, his cybernetic eye scanning the interior systems. "There's no way we can stop him now. If he's on the ship Dash." Rosa cut him off. "Prepare for defense. Lock down all key areas, especially the stasis pod bay. He's coming for the girl, but we're going to make him bleed for it." She keyed in the ship-wide intercom. "All crew to defensive positions. This is it. Kane Drake is on board. We stop him here, or we die." The crew scrambled to follow her orders, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They had all heard the stories about Kane Drake, and none of them wanted to face the man who had brought entire fleets to their knees. As Rosa finished giving her orders, a soft beeping caught her attention. The main console flashed with an alert: internal sabotage in progress. What the dash? She pulled up the display, her eyes widening in disbelief. Someone was accessing the ship's power grid from the engineering bay. Whoever it was had initiated an overload of the reactor core, destabilizing the ship's systems. And judging by the speed and precision of the sabotage, it wasn't one of her crew. "It's the girl," Rosa muttered, her voice filled with frustration and fear. "She's loose." Varric frowned. "What do we do, Captain?" Rosa's face hardened. "We stop them both." Lyra reached the engineering bay and moved quickly to the central power core. The plasma cutter in her hand sparked as she cut through the casing of the control panel. She knew exactly what she needed to do to disable the ship's ability to maneuver and buy her father the time he needed to get them out. Just as she was about to make the final incision, the doors to the engineering bay slid open with a hiss. Rosa Keel stood in the doorway, her blaster aimed directly at Lyra's head. "Don't move, kid," Rosa growled, her finger hovering over the trigger. Lyra didn't flinch. She turned slowly to face Rosa, her eyes cold and unafraid. "You don't want to do this." Rosa smirked. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're not getting off this ship alive. Neither of you are." Before Rosa could fire, a shadow moved behind her. In an instant, Kane Drake appeared, his hand gripping Rosa's arm like a vice. The captain gasped as Kane twisted the blaster out of her hand, his eyes burning with icy fury. "You shouldn't have taken my daughter," Kane said quietly, his voice as cold as the void. Rosa's face twisted with fear as she struggled against his grip, but it was no use. With a swift motion, Kane knocked her unconscious, her body crumpling to the floor. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes meeting her father's. "You took your time," she said with a smirk. Kane's expression softened, just for a moment. "Let's get out of here." Together, father and daughter left the engineering bay, the ship groaning around them as it began to fall apart. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Silver Fawn, the deadliest human in the galaxy had won. The Silver Fawn buckled under the strain, alarms blaring throughout its crumbling corridors as fires erupted from power conduits. The Moira Nebula's electromagnetic storms intensified, shaking the ship as it floated aimlessly through space. Kane Drake and his daughter, Lyra, moved with calculated speed, navigating through the flickering emergency lights toward the breach Kane had created to enter the ship. "How much time do we have before this thing falls apart?" Lyra asked, her voice calm but urgent. Kane glanced at the readings on his wrist console. 5 minutes, if we're lucky. We need to get back to the Widowmaker." They sprinted down the twisting corridors, passing unconscious crew members and shattered panels. The ship's power flickered, and in the distance, they could hear the groaning of the ship's structural integrity beginning to fail. As they reached the docking bay where Kane's boarding tether connected the two ships, Kane suddenly stopped. He turned to face Lyra, his hand gripping her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softened just slightly, a rare moment of emotion from the man known for his cold efficiency. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes sharp and focused. "I'm fine, Dad. But we're not out of this yet." Kane gave a brief nod, proud of her strength. Lyra wasn't just his daughter, she was the only person left in the galaxy who mattered to him. They turned to board the Widowmaker when the ship's intercom crackled to life again, a low voice, harsh and mechanical, cutting through the static. Well, Kane Drake. You didn't think we'd let you take her that easily, did you?" Kane froze, his jaw tightening. He recognized that voice. It wasn't Rosa, the captain of the Silver Fawn, but something much worse. The Consortium. An elusive, shadowy organization that controlled some of the galaxy's most dangerous mercenaries, arms dealers, and corrupt politicians. If they were involved, this was no ordinary bounty job. This was a trap. "They've been watching us the whole time," Lyra whispered, her eyes widening as realization dawned. Kane's hand hovered over his blaster as he looked around the docking bay, scanning for any signs of movement. The Consortium rarely operated in the open, but when they did, it was with overwhelming force. They controlled entire fleets, manipulated governments, and were rumored to possess technology more advanced than anything in the galaxy. The fact that they were involved meant this wasn't just about Lyra, it was about power. "They're coming," Kane said quietly, his voice calm despite the danger. "We need to leave. Now." Back on the bridge of the Silver Fawn, Rosa Keel stirred from unconsciousness, her head pounding. She blinked against the harsh lights as the ship's alarms blared, trying to gather her bearings. She was slumped against the control panel, her arm throbbing where Kane had disarmed her. As she struggled to her feet, a voice echoed through the ship, the same voice that had spoken to Kane. "Captain Rosa Keel, you failed your mission." Rosa's blood ran cold as she recognized the voice. She had only ever dealt with them through intermediaries, but she knew exactly who the consortium was. They had hired her to abduct Lyra Drake, and in exchange, they had promised her enough wealth and power to disappear from the galaxy's radar forever. But she had failed, and the consortium never tolerated failure. "They're going to kill us," Rosa muttered to herself, panic creeping into her voice. The voice on the intercom continued, merciless and cold. "Your usefulness is over. Goodbye, Captain." Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently, but this time it wasn't from the damage the Silver Fawn had already sustained. Rosa stumbled to the viewport, her eyes widening in horror as a fleet of sleek, black ships emerged from hyperspace, surrounding the Silver Fawn and the Widowmaker. The ships were heavily armored and bristling with weapons consortium warships, designed for one purpose: annihilation. Rosa's heart pounded. There was no escape. She was trapped, and she knew it. On board the Widowmaker, Kane and Lyra had just sealed the docking bay door when the proximity alert blared. "Enemy ships incoming," the AI reported. "Consortium fleet detected." Kane's eyes narrowed as he scanned the readouts. The consortium ships had already begun to lock weapons on both the Silver Fawn and the Widowmaker. He had known this job was bigger than it seemed, but he hadn't expected this a full-scale attack. The consortium wanted Lyra for reasons far beyond a simple ransom. She was part of something larger, something far more dangerous. "We're outnumbered," Lyra said, her voice calm despite the urgency. Kane didn't respond at first. His mind worked through the possibilities, scanning for weaknesses in the consortium's formation. He knew they wouldn't give up until they had Lyra or destroyed everything in their path trying. "We'll have to outsmart them," Kane finally said. "Get to the weapons system." "I'll pilot." Lyra nodded and ran to the weapons console, pulling up the targeting systems. Meanwhile, Kane strapped into the pilot's seat, his hands steady as he prepared the Widowmaker for what would be one of the most dangerous battles of his life. The first volley of energy blasts lit up space, consortium ships firing in perfect unison. Kane's hands flew across the controls, spinning the Widowmaker in a tight arc as he dodged the barrage of fire. The ship shook violently, but it held. Lyra locked onto the closest enemy vessel. Firing. The ship's weapons roared to life, sending a hail of plasma bolts toward the lead consortium ship. The blast struck its shields, causing them to flicker, but the enemy ship returned fire with overwhelming force. Kane barely managed to pull them out of the line of fire as another volley of energy blasts streaked past. "They're hurting us," Lyra said, her eyes focused on the tactical display. "They're trying to trap us between their ships and the nebula." Kane's jaw tightened. "Not if we turn this nebula to our advantage." Without warning, he steered the ship directly into the heart of the Moira Nebula. The swirling clouds of electromagnetic storms grew denser, lightning crackling all around them. The consortium ships hesitated, their sensors scrambled by the nebula's interference, but the Widowmaker pressed on, its advanced systems compensating for the storm. "We can't fight them head-on," Kane said. "We have to use the nebula's storms to level the playing field." Lyra nodded, understanding her father's plan. The nebula's chaotic energy fields could disrupt the consortium's communications and weapons systems, giving them a chance to strike without being overwhelmed. As they dove deeper into the nebula, the consortium fleet pursued, but their formation faltered, their ships struggling to maintain position in the storm. Kane spun the Widowmaker around, launching a volley of missiles into the heart of the enemy fleet. The missiles detonated amidst the consortium ships, sending shockwaves through the swirling clouds. One of the enemy ships exploded in a burst of fire and debris, its systems overwhelmed by the nebula's energy. Lyra smiled grimly. "That's one down." But there were still more ships coming, and the storm wasn't enough to stop them all. Dad, Lyra said, her voice tight. We can't stay here. The nebula's tearing us apart. Kane gritted his teeth. He knew she was right. The ship's hull was already starting to fracture under the pressure, and the consortium was relentless. They couldn't win this fight not alone. Just then, a new signal appeared on the radar, cutting through the nebula's interference. It was a large ship, much larger than anything they had seen before. Kane's eyes widened as he recognized the signature. It's a destroyer, Lyra whispered. That's a consortium flagship. Kane's heart sank. The consortium had brought their full might to bear. He could fight, but even the Widowmaker wouldn't survive against a ship that size. Before he could react, the destroyer unleashed a massive energy pulse, sending a shockwave through the nebula. The ship shook violently as the pulse hit them, and the controls flickered. We're losing power, Lyra shouted. Kane slammed his fist into the console, desperately trying to regain control. The Widowmaker sputtered, its engines failing as the destroyer closed in for the kill. But just as the consortium flagship prepared to fire, a bright, blinding light exploded from behind it. Another ship, sleek and deadly, dropped out of hyperspace, its cannons blazing. The consortium fleet scattered as the new arrival tore through their ranks with ruthless efficiency. Kane's eyes widened in shock. That's the Resistance. Lyra looked at him in disbelief. The Resistance? They're fighting the consortium? Kane didn't have time to explain. We're out of time. Hold on. Using the distraction, Kane rerouted power to the engines and pushed the Widowmaker forward, escaping the nebula just as the Resistance ships engaged the consortium fleet in full-scale battle. As they sped away, Lyra looked back at the chaotic scene unfolding behind them. The consortium had been defeated for now, but this wasn't over. They had learned one thing today: the galaxy was on the verge of something much bigger, a war for control of everything. Kane glanced at his daughter, his expression grim. We've stepped into a war, Lyra. The consortium won't stop coming after you. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. Then we'll make sure they regret it. Kane gave a small, approving nod. Together, they vanished into the stars, ready to face whatever the galaxy had to throw at them next.